The diplomatic reception aboard the Galactic Council Station Harmony Prime was supposed to be a simple affair. Ambassador Sarah Chun adjusted her dark hair one final time before entering the Grand Hall, where representatives from dozens of species mingled under the soft glow of bioluminescent ceiling panels. As one of humanity's first official ambassadors to the greater galactic community, she carried the weight of her entire species' reputation on her shoulders. The humans had only recently been accepted into the Galactic Council after proving they weren't the savage warmongers many species believed them to be. It had taken 3 years of careful negotiations, cultural exchanges, and more than a few misunderstandings to reach this point. Tonight's reception was meant to celebrate humanity's formal induction as a full-member species. Sarah moved through the crowd with practiced, diplomatic grace, her heels clicking softly on the polished metal floor. She exchanged pleasantries with the crystalline Zolonians, whose bodies chimed musically when they spoke, and bowed respectfully to the towering Corvalian delegation, their tree-like forms swaying gently in the artificial breeze. The atmosphere was genuinely warm and welcoming, a far cry from the suspicious glares and whispered conversations that had greeted humanity's first contact teams. Sarah allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. Perhaps the galaxy was finally ready to accept humans as equals rather than curiosities. Near the center of the hall, she spotted Commander Rex Morrison, the other human representative present. The former military officer looked distinctly uncomfortable in his formal diplomatic attire, tugging at his collar as he spoke with a group of aquatic thalassans in their environmental suits. His short-cropped gray hair and weathered face spoke of years spent in space, fighting the very wars that had initially made the galaxy wary of humanity. Ambassador Chun, a melodious voice called out behind her. Sarah turned to see Counselor Velith approaching, her six-armed form gliding gracefully across the floor. The hegemony representative's purple skin shimmered with bioluminescent patterns that indicated pleasure and respect. Counselor Velith, Sarah replied, offering the complex hand gesture that served as a greeting among the hegemony. Thank you for hosting such a wonderful reception. The pleasure is entirely ours, Velith replied, her translation device rendering her natural harmonics into standard galactic. It is not often we welcome a new species with such fascinating capabilities. There was something in the way she said fascinating that made Sarah's diplomatic instincts prickle. The hegemony had been among humanity's strongest supporters during the application process, but they had also shown an almost scientific interest in human physiology and psychology that sometimes felt invasive. We're honored by the Council's acceptance, Sarah said carefully. Humanity looks forward to contributing to galactic peace and prosperity. Indeed, Velith's patterns shifted to what Sarah had learned indicated curiosity. Tell me, Ambassador, is it true that humans are capable of surviving in environments that would kill most other species? Sarah felt the familiar weight of explaining humanity's unusual resilience. We evolved on a particularly challenging world, she said diplomatically. It made us somewhat adaptable. What she didn't say was that somewhat adaptable was a massive understatement. Earth's classification as a Class 12 Deathworld had shocked the galactic community. Most sapient species evolved on garden worlds with stable climates, limited geological activity, and relatively benign flora and fauna. Earth, by contrast, was a planet that seemed actively hostile to life, with massive storms, seismic activity, temperature extremes, and predators that would give most aliens nightmares. The fact that humans had not only survived but thrived in such conditions, developing complex civilization and eventually reaching the stars, was something the galaxy was still trying to understand. Some species viewed it with admiration, others with fear, and a few with the kind of scientific fascination that made Sarah uncomfortable. Across the hall, a new group of beings entered the reception area. Sarah recognized them immediately as HFY, a relatively new species to the Council themselves. They were roughly humanoid in shape, but taller and more angular, with pale blue skin and elongated limbs. What made them distinctive were the neural tendrils that grew from their scalps like living hair, constantly moving and shifting as they processed sensory information. The HFY were known for their advanced biotechnology and their somewhat aggressive approach to scientific research. They had joined the council only 50 years ago and were still considered somewhat unpredictable by older member species. Sarah watched as the HFY delegation moved through the crowd, their leader pausing to examine various beings with what seemed like clinical interest. When his gaze fell on her and Commander Morrison, his tendrils began moving more rapidly, a sign of excitement or agitation in their species. "Excuse me, Counselor," Sarah said politely to Velith. "I should greet our new arrivals." She made her way across the hall toward the HFY group, intercepting them near a display of flowering plants from the Corvallian homeworld. The leader of the delegation, whose designation translated roughly to First Researcher Zakhan, turned his attention to her as she approached. "Ambassador Chun," he said through his translator, though his pronunciation of her name was noticeably stilted. "I am First Researcher Zakhan of the HFY Collective. We are most interested to meet representatives of the famous Deathworld species." There was something in his tone that immediately put Sarah on guard. Unlike Counselor Velith's scientific curiosity, which felt academic and respectful, Zakhan's interests seemed more predatory. His neural tendrils writhed constantly as he spoke, and his pale eyes never stopped moving, cataloging every detail of her appearance and behavior. "The pleasure is ours, First Researcher," Sarah replied, maintaining her diplomatic composure. "We've heard remarkable things about HFY biotechnology." Indeed, Zakhan moved closer, his tendrils reaching toward her before stopping just short of contact. "Your species fascinates us greatly. Such primitive evolution, yet such robust results." Sarah felt her jaw tighten slightly at the word primitive, but kept her expression neutral. Every species evolves according to the challenges of their environment. I wouldn't call any evolutionary path primitive. Zakhan's tendrils moved faster, and Sarah caught what might have been amusement in his expression. Of course. But surely you must acknowledge that most civilized species have moved beyond such crude physical adaptations. We have evolved past the need for such rough survival mechanisms." Commander Morrison had noticed the conversation and was moving toward them, his military instincts clearly triggered by something in Zakhan's demeanor. Sarah caught his eye and gave a subtle shake of her head. The last thing they needed was to create a diplomatic incident by having their military representative intervene in what was supposed to be a peaceful first meeting. "I find that diversity of adaptation is one of the galaxy's greatest strengths," Sarah said diplomatically. "Each species brings unique perspectives and capabilities that benefit us all." "Perspectives, yes," Zakhan said, his tendrils now moving in what Sarah was beginning to recognize as an aggressive pattern. "But surely you cannot believe that crude physical traits can compare to advanced biological engineering? For instance," he gestured toward her hair, which she had worn long and loose for the formal occasion. "Such primitive filaments, dead protein strands serving no function beyond obsolete display behaviors. In our species, every follicular structure serves a vital neurological purpose." Sarah felt her diplomatic training warring with a growing sense of irritation. The HFY's dismissive attitude toward human biology was not only insulting but demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of evolutionary biology. But before she could formulate a response, Zakhan made a mistake that would change the entire trajectory of the evening. "May I?" he said, extending one elongated hand toward her hair. But he didn't wait for permission. Instead, his fingers closed around a strand of her dark hair and pulled hard. The pain was sharp and sudden, and Sarah's reaction was immediate and instinctive. Her hand shot up to grab Zakhan's wrist, her fingers closing around the alien's arm with enough force to make his pale blue skin darken where she gripped him. The strength of her grasp was far beyond what any other species in the room could have generated. "Let go," she said quietly, her voice carrying an edge that made nearby conversations falter. Zakhan's tendrils went rigid with shock, not from pain but from the realization of what was happening. The grip on his wrist was slowly increasing in pressure, and his advanced biology was screaming warnings about potential bone fractures and circulatory compromise. Around them, the reception guests were beginning to notice the confrontation. I merely wish to examine," Zakhan started to say, but Sarah's grip tightened fractionally, and his words cut off. I said, "Let go," Sarah repeated, her dark eyes locked on his. There was something in her gaze that spoke of predators and survival instincts honed over millions of years of evolution on a world that didn't forgive weakness. Commander Morrison had reached them now, his own instincts clearly on high alert. He didn't intervene directly, but his presence added to the suddenly charged atmosphere. Other guests were backing away slightly, sensing that something significant was happening even if they didn't understand the details. Zakhan released her hair with obvious reluctance, but Sarah didn't immediately let go of his wrist. Instead, she studied his face with the same clinical interest he had shown toward her. "First researcher," she said conversationally, though her grip remained firm. "I think there's something you should understand about human evolution. You see, on our world, grabbing another being without permission is often interpreted as an act of aggression. And humans who survived long enough to reproduce were those who could respond effectively to aggression." The neural tendrils on Zakhan's head were now completely still, which Sarah had learned indicated either deep thought or significant stress. Around them, the reception had gone almost completely quiet, with representatives from dozens of species watching the interaction with fascination and growing concern. "Our hair," Sarah continued in the same calm, conversational tone, "isn't just dead protein strands. It's part of a complex sensory system that includes nerve endings in the follicles. When you pulled my hair, you caused actual pain. And humans, as you noted, are somewhat primitive in our responses to pain inflicted by others." She could see understanding beginning to dawn in Zakhan's pale eyes. The Kethvar had approached this interaction with the assumption that they were dealing with a physically inferior species that could be examined and handled like a specimen. They were beginning to realize that this assumption might have been catastrophically wrong. "Ambassador Chun," Counselor Velitha's voice came from nearby, her bioluminescent patterns flickering rapidly with what Sarah recognized as alarm. "Perhaps we could discuss this matter more privately?" Sarah looked around at the gathered crowd, noting the wide range of expressions and body language. Some species looked frightened, others fascinated, and a few seemed to be recording the interaction for later analysis. This was exactly the kind of incident that could set back human-galactic relations significantly. But it was also, she realized, an opportunity. For too long, humanity had been walking on diplomatic eggshells, trying to prove they weren't the violent savages many species believed them to be. Perhaps it was time to demonstrate that there was a difference between being violent and being capable of violence when necessary. "I think," Sarah said slowly, her eyes never leaving Zakhan's face, "that this is actually an excellent learning opportunity for everyone present." She adjusted her grip slightly, not increasing the pressure but shifting it in a way that demonstrated her complete control over the situation. Zakhan's breathing had become more rapid, and she could see perspiration beginning to form on his pale blue skin. "You see," she continued, addressing not just Zakhan but the entire gathering, "humans understand that in any social interaction, there are boundaries. We've spent thousands of years developing complex social protocols specifically to avoid unnecessary conflict. But those protocols depend on mutual respect." The hall was now completely silent except for the soft hum of the station's life support systems. Sarah could feel the weight of dozens of alien gazes, some sympathetic, others calculating, many simply curious about what would happen next. Commander Morrison stepped slightly closer, not threateningly, but in a way that demonstrated human solidarity. His own expression was carefully neutral, but Sarah could see the approval in his eyes. He understood what she was doing. "When someone violates those boundaries," Sarah continued, "especially when they do so while dismissing our biology as primitive, it forces us to fall back on older, more direct forms of communication." She finally released Zakhan's wrist, but the alien didn't immediately step back. Instead, he stood frozen, staring at the marks her fingers had left on his pale blue skin. The impression of her grip was clearly visible, and would likely remain for some time. "I apologize," Sarah said formally, though her tone suggested she wasn't particularly sorry, "if my response seems excessive. But I thought it important to demonstrate that human adaptations shouldn't be underestimated simply because they appear primitive to more advanced species." The silence stretched for several more seconds before Counselor Veleth cleared her throat in the way her species indicated a desire to speak. Perhaps, she said carefully, we should all take a moment to process this educational exchange. But first, researcher Zakhan wasn't finished. His neural tendrils had begun moving again, slowly at first, then with increasing agitation. When he spoke, his voice carried a note that Sarah couldn't quite identify, but that made Commander Morrison tense visibly. Fascinating, Zakhan said, flexing his wrist and examining the marks Sarah had left. Absolutely fascinating. Such raw physical power in such a compact biological package. And the neural pathways required to maintain such precise control while under social stress. He looked up at Sarah with an expression that was no longer dismissive but had become something far more disturbing. His pale eyes held a hunger that made her skin crawl. Tell me, Ambassador, he said, his voice taking on an almost hypnotic quality. What other capabilities does your primitive biology possess? What other stress responses might we observe under different stimuli? The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Sarah felt her diplomatic training screaming warnings even as her more primitive instincts prepared for what felt increasingly like a threat. Around them, she could sense other species beginning to understand that this interaction had moved well beyond a simple cultural misunderstanding. Commander Morrison's hand moved almost imperceptibly toward where his sidearm would normally rest, though of course no weapons were permitted at diplomatic functions. The gesture was unconscious, but telling. First researcher, Sarah said carefully, I think you may be misunderstanding the nature of this demonstration. This wasn't an invitation for further experimentation. But Zakhan's tendrils were now moving in complex patterns that Sarah didn't recognize, and his expression had taken on an intensity that was making nearby aliens step back involuntarily. On the contrary, he said, moving closer despite the obvious warning signals from both humans, I believe this is exactly the kind of data our species needs to better understand the galactic community's newest members. Such a unique opportunity to observe Deathworlder stress responses in controlled conditions. The way he said controlled conditions made it clear that he wasn't talking about the diplomatic reception anymore. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she realized that the Kethvar might have come to this gathering with purposes far beyond simple diplomatic courtesy. The evening had taken a turn that no amount of diplomatic training had prepared her for. As she looked into Zakhan's increasingly predatory gaze, Sarah began to understand that humanity's integration into galactic society might be far more complicated and dangerous than anyone had anticipated. And somewhere in the back of her mind, the part of her brain that had evolved to survive on a world full of predators was beginning to wake up, bringing with it responses that the civilized galaxy was completely unprepared to handle. The silence that followed Zakhan's words was pregnant with tension. Sarah could feel the collective attention of dozens of alien species focused on the small circle of space where she stood facing the Kethvar researcher. The bioluminescent panels overhead seemed to pulse more rapidly, as if the station itself sensed the growing conflict. Commander Morrison moved another step closer, his military bearing becoming more pronounced. First researcher, he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of commanding troops in hostile territory. I believe you may be operating under some misconceptions about human diplomatic protocols. Zakhan's neural tendrils swayed toward Morrison, and Sarah saw something flicker across the alien's features that might have been amusement. Ah yes, the military specimen. Your files indicated you were involved in several armed conflicts before your species achieved council candidacy. Most illuminating reading. Sarah felt a cold knot form in her stomach. The fact that the Kethvar had been studying human military records suggested a level of interest that went far beyond normal diplomatic preparation. She exchanged a quick glance with Morrison, seeing her own concerns reflected in his weathered features. Standard diplomatic research, Morrison replied carefully, but his eyes never left Zakhan's face. I'm sure you'll understand that former military personnel often serve in diplomatic roles, given our experience in complex negotiations. Complex negotiations, Zakhan repeated, his tendrils moving in patterns that were becoming increasingly agitated. Yes, we found your records quite fascinating. The incident on Kepler 442b, for instance. 17 hostile aliens neutralized in hand-to-hand combat when your weapon systems failed. Remarkable physical capabilities for a species that evolved on what most consider an inhospitable world. The temperature in Sarah's veins seemed to drop another few degrees. Kepler 442b had been a classified operation, a rescue mission that had gone sideways when first contact with the local inhabitants proved difficult. The fact that the Kethvar had access to those records meant they had intelligence sources that went well beyond what any council species should possess. First researcher, Counselor Velith interjected, her bioluminescent patterns flickering rapidly in what Sarah had learned indicated serious concern. Perhaps this conversation would be better suited to a more private setting? But Zakhan seemed oblivious to the diplomatic hints being dropped around him. His attention was fixed on the two humans with an intensity that was making several nearby species shift uncomfortably. The thalassans had retreated behind their aquatic environmental suits, and even the usually unflappable Corvallians were swaying with what Sarah recognized as agitation. Privacy would defeat the purpose, Zakhan said, his voice taking on that hypnotic quality again. You see, Counselor, the Kethvar Collective has been conducting extensive research into the phenomenon of Deathworld evolution. The emergence of a sapient species from such a hostile environment represents a unique opportunity to study adaptive mechanisms that our more civilized evolutionary paths have never required. Sarah felt her diplomatic mask slipping slightly. And what exactly does that research entail? First researcher. Zakhan's pale eyes gleamed with an enthusiasm that was becoming increasingly disturbing. Stress testing, primarily. Physiological and psychological responses to various stimuli. Pain tolerance, reaction speeds, decision-making under pressure. The preliminary data we've gathered from your species' historical records is fascinating, but hardly sufficient for proper scientific analysis. The words hung in the air like a physical weight. Around the room, Sarah could sense the other species beginning to understand the implications of what they were hearing. The Kethvar weren't interested in humanity as allies or even as subjects for peaceful study. They saw humans as specimens to be tested, prodded, and potentially dissected for scientific knowledge. Commander Morrison's posture had shifted almost imperceptibly, his weight balanced on the balls of his feet in a way that suggested readiness for immediate action. Years of combat experience had given him an ability to sense predators that went beyond conscious thought, and every instinct he possessed was screaming warnings about the alien in front of them. I'm afraid, Sarah said carefully, that humanity doesn't participate in involuntary scientific experimentation. Our own history has taught us the dangers of such research. Zakhan's tendrils suddenly went completely still, which Sarah was beginning to recognize as a sign of intense focus. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its hypnotic quality and become something far more direct and threatening. Involuntary? But, my dear ambassador, you misunderstand completely. The experimentation has already begun. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Around the reception hall, she could see other species beginning to react with alarm as the implications became clear. Even Counselor Velith's usually composed demeanor was cracking, her bioluminescent patterns shifting to colors that Sarah didn't recognize, but that seemed to indicate shock or fear. What exactly are you saying? Morrison demanded, his diplomatic facade abandoning him entirely in favor of the direct approach that had kept him alive through dozens of combat situations. Zakhan's expression had transformed from scientific curiosity to something that could only be described as predatory satisfaction. The reception, Commander Morrison. The carefully chosen guest list, the specific refreshments, even the environmental controls. Everything has been designed to create optimal conditions for observing human stress responses. Sarah felt the world shift slightly around her as the full scope of what was happening became clear. This wasn't a diplomatic reception at all. It was a laboratory, and she and Morrison were the test subjects. You see, Zakhan continued, seemingly oblivious to the growing alarm around him. We needed to observe humans in what you believe to be a safe, social environment. Only by establishing baseline behaviors could we properly measure your responses to escalating stress stimuli. The neural tendrils on his head began moving in complex, coordinated patterns, and Sarah realized with growing horror that they might be recording everything that was happening. Every word, every gesture, every physiological response was being cataloged for later analysis. The hair-pulling incident was merely the first stage, Zakhan explained with the enthusiasm of a researcher describing a particularly successful experiment. A minor physical provocation to test basic defensive responses. Your reaction was quite illuminating, Ambassador Chen. The speed, precision, and controlled application of force exceeded our models by approximately 37%. Sarah felt something cold and primitive stirring in the depths of her mind. It was a feeling she recognized from childhood nightmares, from old stories passed down through generations of humans who had survived on a world that didn't forgive weakness. It was the feeling of being hunted. And what exactly, she said, her voice remaining steady despite the adrenaline beginning to flood her system, constitutes the next stage of your experiment? Zakhan's expression brightened with genuine scientific enthusiasm. Excellent question. We need to test responses to multiple stressors simultaneously. Physical threat, psychological pressure, and, perhaps most importantly, threat to companions. Our research indicates that humans demonstrate remarkable performance enhancements when protecting others of their species. Morrison had gone completely still in a way that Sarah recognized from their military briefings. It was the stillness of a predator calculating distance, timing, and angles of attack. When he spoke, his voice carried undertones that would have been familiar to anyone who had served in combat zones. First, researcher, I strongly advise you to reconsider your current course of action. But Zakhan seemed completely oblivious to the warning implicit in Morrison's tone. Instead, he gestured to several points around the reception hall, and Sarah realized with growing alarm that other members of the HFY delegation had positioned themselves at strategic locations throughout the room. The beauty of the design, Zakhan continued, is that we can escalate the stress parameters while maintaining the illusion of a social gathering. For instance, we might introduce the suggestion that one of you has been poisoned by the refreshments, or perhaps indicate that the station's life support systems have been compromised. Small lies, but ones that would trigger interesting defensive responses. The casual way he discussed psychological torture made Sarah's skin crawl. Around the room, she could see other species beginning to understand that they weren't just witnesses to this confrontation, but potentially unwilling participants in whatever the HFY had planned. Counselor Velith stepped forward, her usually melodious voice carrying an edge of authority that Sarah had never heard before. First, researcher Zakhan, I must insist that you cease this line of research immediately. The Galactic Council does not condone experimentation on sapient beings without explicit consent. Zakhan's tendrils swayed toward Velith with what might have been dismissive amusement. Counselor, surely you understand the value of the data we're collecting? These humans represent the first Deathworld species to achieve Council membership. Understanding their capabilities could revolutionize our knowledge of evolutionary adaptation under extreme conditions. Understanding achieved through torture and deception, Morrison said flatly, is not scientific research. It's something else entirely. Torture. Zakhan seemed genuinely surprised by the description. Commander, you dramatically overstate the severity of our methods. We're simply creating controlled stress conditions to observe natural responses. No permanent harm is intended. Sarah felt her diplomatic training warring with instincts that were far older and more primitive. The rational part of her mind understood that any violent response would play directly into the HFY's experimental design while potentially creating a diplomatic incident that could damage humanity's standing in the galactic community for generations. But the deeper part of her brain, the part that had evolved to survive on a world where being hunted was a daily reality, was beginning to override rational thought with something far more direct and immediate. No permanent harm, she repeated, her voice taking on a quality that made several nearby aliens step back involuntarily. First, researcher, I think you may have made a fundamental error in your research design. Zakhan's tendrils moved faster, clearly excited by what he interpreted as the beginning of a more significant stress response. Oh, and what error might that be? Sarah looked around the reception hall, taking in the carefully positioned HFY operatives, the nervous expressions of the other alien species, and the growing tension that filled the space like a physical presence. When she spoke again, her voice carried overtones that spoke of predators and survival instincts honed over millions of years of evolution. You assumed that humans would continue to follow diplomatic protocols even after discovering they were being experimented on without consent. That was a mistake. The words seemed to hang in the air with an almost physical weight. Around the room, Sarah could see various species beginning to understand that they were about to witness something unprecedented in galactic diplomatic history. Morrison had shifted into a stance that would have been familiar to anyone who had served in the colonial marines. His diplomatic facade was gone entirely, replaced by the cold competence of a career soldier who had spent years fighting in environments where hesitation meant death. You see, Sarah continued, her eyes never leaving Zakhan's face. Humans have a saying, when you're being hunted, stop being prey and start being the predator. I think it's time for a practical demonstration of that philosophy. Zakhan's neural tendrils suddenly went rigid with what Sarah was beginning to recognize as alarm. For the first time since the conversation began, the HFY researcher seemed to understand that his experimental subjects might not react the way his models predicted. Now, Ambassador, he said, his hypnotic tone returning but now edged with nervousness. Let's not allow emotional responses to override rational thought. This is precisely the kind of data we need to collect, but escalation serves no one's interests. Sarah smiled, and it was not a diplomatic expression. It was something far older and more dangerous, the kind of smile that apex predators might have worn in Earth's prehistoric jungles. First researcher, she said conversationally, I think you're about to collect more data than you bargained for. The reception hall fell into complete silence as two completely different evolutionary philosophies prepared to collide in ways that would reshape the galactic community's understanding of what it meant to be human. The silence that followed Sarah's words was broken by an unexpected sound, laughter. It came from Commander Morrison, low and controlled, the kind of laugh that soldiers developed when facing impossible odds. It was not a sound that suggested amusement. You know what's funny? Morrison said, his voice carrying across the now silent reception hall. Back on Earth, we have these things called ethics committees. They exist specifically to prevent the kind of research you're describing. Zakhan's tendrils twitched with what Sarah was beginning to recognize as confusion. Ethics committees? For scientific advancement. How remarkably primitive. Our research methods are designed for optimal data collection with minimal resource expenditure. Minimal resource expenditure, Sarah repeated, her diplomatic training finally losing its battle with more primitive instincts. Is that how you classify sapient beings? Resources. Around the reception hall, she could see other species beginning to react with visible alarm to the conversation they were witnessing. The crystalline Zolonians were chiming with frequencies that sounded distinctly agitated, while the thalassans had retreated so far into their environmental suits that only their eye stalks were visible. Not resources, Zakhan corrected with what seemed like genuine academic precision, specimens. Though I suppose the distinction is largely semantic when applied to species of limited evolutionary sophistication. Her fingers found specific pressure points that would cause maximum discomfort without permanent damage, a technique taught to human diplomats specifically for situations where traditional negotiation failed. Zakhan's neural tendrils went completely rigid as pain signals flooded his nervous system. His pale blue skin darkened where Sarah's fingers pressed, and his breathing became rapid and shallow. Around them, the other Kethvar operatives began moving toward the confrontation, but they stopped abruptly when Morrison shifted into a combat stance that somehow managed to threaten all of them simultaneously. Here's the thing about Deathworld evolution, Sarah said conversationally, as if she were discussing the weather rather than inflicting carefully controlled pain on a being who had been planning to torture her for scientific data. It doesn't just make us physically resilient. It makes us tactically creative. She adjusted her grip slightly, finding another pressure point that made Zakhan gasp audibly. His tendrils were now completely motionless, and his pale eyes had widened with what could only be described as genuine fear. You see, Sarah continued, when you evolve on a world where everything is trying to kill you, you develop very specific responses to being threatened. And, right now, first researcher, you represent a threat not just to me, but to my entire species' integration into galactic society. Counselor Velith stepped forward, her bioluminescent patterns flickering rapidly with alarm. Ambassador Chun, perhaps we could resolve this situation through more traditional diplomatic channels? Sarah looked at the hegemony representative with an expression that was calm and reasonable despite the fact that she was systematically applying nerve pressure techniques to an alien researcher. Counselor, I appreciate your concern, but I'm afraid traditional diplomacy assumes good faith negotiation. What we're dealing with here is something else entirely. Morrison had positioned himself where he could monitor all the Kethvar operatives simultaneously, his military training allowing him to track multiple potential threats while maintaining awareness of civilian positions. Ambassador's right, he said, never taking his eyes off the aliens who were slowly trying to encircle their position. This isn't a diplomatic misunderstanding. It's a planned operation. Zakhan was struggling to speak through the pain Sarah was inflicting, his words coming out in gasps. You're proving our theories about Deathworld aggression patterns. Sarah's grip tightened fractionally, and Zakhan's words cut off entirely. Actually, she said with the kind of calm precision that teachers might use when correcting a particularly slow student, I'm demonstrating human problem-solving capabilities. You presented us with a threat that couldn't be resolved through normal diplomatic channels. So we're adapting our approach to match the situation you created. Around the hall, the other species were watching the confrontation with a mixture of fascination and horror. Most galactic civilizations had evolved past the point where physical violence was a common solution to social problems. The sight of one being systematically applying pressure point techniques to another was both alien and deeply disturbing to creatures who had spent millennia developing elaborate social protocols to avoid exactly this kind of direct confrontation. But Sarah could also see something else in their expressions: respect. There was a growing understanding among the observers that the humans weren't responding with random violence, but with precise, controlled application of force designed to neutralize a specific threat while minimizing collateral damage. The beautiful thing about human evolution, Morrison added, his voice carrying the kind of conversational tone that veteran soldiers used when discussing tactics, is that it gave us pattern recognition capabilities specifically designed to identify predatory behavior. One of the Kethvar operatives took a step closer, and Morrison shifted his stance in a way that suggested he could reach the alien before it could complete whatever action it was considering. The operative stopped moving immediately. And, right now, Morrison continued, every pattern recognition system we possess is telling us that you're not researchers. You're hunters who made the mistake of trying to hunt something that evolved to be the apex predator on one of the most dangerous worlds in known space. Zakhan managed to force out a few words despite Sarah's grip. This is exactly the data we need, human response to perceived threats. Sarah looked at him with an expression of genuine curiosity. You know what's really interesting, first researcher? You're still thinking like prey. Even now, when you're experiencing firsthand what happens when you threaten a human, you're trying to categorize it as data for your research. She released one pressure point and found another, causing a different kind of pain that made Zakhan's entire body tense with involuntary muscle contractions. But here's what your research models didn't account for. Humans don't just respond to threats. We eliminate them. The words carried a weight that seemed to settle over the entire reception hall like a physical presence. The other alien species were beginning to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented in galactic diplomatic history. The point at which a Deathworld species stopped pretending to be civilized and started demonstrating exactly why their homeworld had earned its classification. Counselor Velith made another attempt at diplomatic intervention. Ambassador Chun, surely we can find a solution that doesn't require physical persuasion? Sarah looked at the hegemony representative with genuine regret. Counselor, I wish we could. But the Kethvar have made it clear that they don't respect traditional diplomatic boundaries. They've essentially declared that humanity exists for their scientific entertainment. That's not a position we can negotiate with. It's a position we can correct, Morrison added grimly, his attention still focused on the other Kethvar operatives who were becoming increasingly agitated as their leader's distress became more obvious. Zakhan was struggling against Sarah's grip now, his neural tendrils beginning to move in frantic patterns that suggested genuine panic. Please, We can discuss alternative research methodologies. Sarah's expression softened slightly, but her grip remained constant. Oh, we're definitely going to discuss alternative methodologies, starting with the concept of informed consent. She adjusted her position slightly, maintaining her hold on Zakon while addressing the broader audience of alien observers. You see, everyone, this is what humans call a teachable moment. The first researcher believed that he could study us like laboratory specimens because he assumed we would continue to follow your social protocols even after discovering his intentions. Her voice carried clearly across the silent reception hall, ensuring that every species representative could hear her words. But humans have a different set of protocols for dealing with beings who treat us as experimental subjects. We call them self-defense protocols, and they tend to be rather more direct than the diplomatic approaches we prefer to use. One of the thalassans emerged slightly from their environmental suit to speak through their translation system. Ambassador, are you saying that humans would resort to violence when threatened? Sarah considered the question carefully. I'm saying that humans will resort to whatever methods are necessary to neutralize threats to our survival or autonomy. Violence is simply one tool in our tactical arsenal. We prefer negotiation, but we're not limited to it. Morrison nodded agreement. The key difference, he added, is that most species seem to view violence and diplomacy as mutually exclusive. Humans see them as different approaches to the same problem, achieving security for ourselves and our allies. Zakon was making increasingly desperate sounds as Sarah's grip continued to apply precisely calibrated pressure to his nervous system. His tendrils had begun moving in patterns that looked almost like signals, and Sarah realized with growing concern that he might be trying to communicate with his operatives. First researcher, she said, her voice taking on a warning tone, I strongly advise against any attempts to coordinate a response with your team. Right now, we're having a civilized discussion about research ethics. If this becomes a combat situation, the educational value of the experience will increase dramatically for everyone involved. The threat was delivered with such calm precision that several of the alien observers actually backed further away from the confrontation. The Corvallians were swaying with what Sarah recognized as extreme agitation, while the Zolonians had begun chiming in frequencies that sounded almost like alarm calls. But it was Counselor Veleth who surprised everyone by stepping forward with an expression of what could only be described as grim determination. First researcher Zakon, she said, her bioluminescent patterns shifting to colors that Sarah didn't recognize, but that seemed to carry official weight. By the authority vested in me by the Galactic Council, I hereby suspend all Kethvar research operations pending a full investigation into your methods and objectives. Zakon's struggles became more frantic as the implications of Veleth's words became clear. A council suspension would effectively end his research program and potentially result in sanctions against his entire species. All of his careful planning, all of the resources invested in this operation would be lost. You cannot, he gasped, his words barely audible through the pain Sarah was inflicting. The data, the potential applications, the knowledge we could gain. Sarah looked at him with an expression that might have been pity if it weren't for the cold calculation in her eyes. First researcher, here's one final piece of data for your research. Humans have a very simple rule about beings who try to treat us as experimental subjects. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, but somehow every being in the reception hall could hear her words clearly. We make sure they never get the chance to do it again. The threat in Sarah's whispered words seemed to resonate through the reception hall like a physical force. Around the room, alien observers were beginning to understand that they were witnessing something that would fundamentally change how the galactic community viewed humanity. This wasn't just a diplomatic incident or a cultural misunderstanding. This was a demonstration of what happened when a Deathworld species decided that peaceful coexistence had limits. Zakon's neural tendrils had gone completely limp, no longer trying to signal his operatives or record data. The pain Sarah was inflicting had moved beyond mere physical discomfort into something that was affecting his ability to process complex thoughts. His pale blue skin had taken on an alarming grayish tint, and his breathing had become shallow and rapid. Ambassador, Counselor Veleth said carefully, her bioluminescent patterns now cycling through colors that suggested urgent concern. While I understand your position, perhaps we should consider the broader diplomatic implications of this situation. Sarah didn't release her grip, but her attention shifted to the hegemony representative. What diplomatic implications, Counselor? The Kethvar have demonstrated that they view sapient beings as experimental subjects. They violated basic principles of informed consent that every civilized species should understand. What exactly are we supposed to negotiate about? Commander Morrison had positioned himself where he could see all the Kethvar operatives simultaneously, and his expression suggested that he was not impressed with what he was observing. More importantly, he added, they came to this reception with a planned operation. This wasn't spontaneous research opportunity. They targeted us specifically. One of the Kethvar operatives, apparently second in command based on the complexity of their neural tendril patterns, stepped forward with obvious reluctance. Honored representatives, it said through a translation device. Perhaps there has been a misunderstanding about our research objectives. Sarah turned her attention to the new speaker while maintaining her grip on Zakon. Please, enlighten us about your actual objectives. The operative's tendrils moved in patterns that Sarah was beginning to associate with carefully prepared statements. The Kethvar Collective has invested significant resources in understanding the unique capabilities of Deathworld species. Our research could benefit the entire galactic community by expanding our knowledge of evolutionary adaptation under extreme conditions. Benefit the galactic community, Morrison repeated, his voice carrying the kind of skepticism that came from years of dealing with politicians who used noble language to disguise less noble intentions. And how exactly would torturing humans benefit anyone except the Kethvar? The operative's tendrils twitched with what might have been embarrassment. Torture is a harsh characterization. We prefer to think of our methods as intensive data collection. Sarah felt something cold and primitive surge through her nervous system at those words. It was a feeling that spoke of ancestral memories, of predators and prey, of situations where survival depended on immediate and overwhelming response to threats. Intensive data collection, she repeated, her voice taking on a quality that made several nearby aliens step back involuntarily. Is that what you called it when you planned to poison us? When you discussed compromising the station's life support systems? Intensive data collection. The operative's response was cut off by a sound that none of the aliens in the room had ever heard before, the low, rumbling growl that emerged from Sarah's throat. It wasn't a conscious vocalization, but something far more primitive, a sound that evolution had programmed into humans during millions of years of surviving on a world where making the right kind of threatening noise could mean the difference between life and death. The effect on the alien observers was immediate and profound. Species that had evolved on garden worlds, where the most dangerous creatures were equivalent to Earth's rabbits, had no evolutionary framework for processing the sound of an apex predator expressing displeasure. Several of them backed away so rapidly that they collided with furniture or each other. Zakon's eyes widened with what could only be described as terror as the sound registered in his nervous system. His neural tendrils had gone completely rigid, and his pale blue skin was now almost gray with stress-induced circulation problems. You see, Sarah said conversationally, as if the growl hadn't happened at all, this is what your research models didn't account for. You studied our historical records, our military engagements, our diplomatic protocols. But you didn't understand the most important thing about humans. She adjusted her grip slightly, finding a new pressure point that made Zakon's entire body convulse with involuntary muscle spasms. We're not just intelligent animals who evolved on a dangerous world. We're predators who learned to think. And, right now, you're exhibiting all the behavioral patterns that evolution taught us to associate with threats that need to be eliminated. Counselor Velith made another attempt at diplomatic intervention, but her usual composure was cracking under the strain of the situation. Ambassador Chun, surely we can find a resolution that doesn't require such direct methods. Sarah looked at the hegemony representative with an expression that was calm and reasonable despite the circumstances. Counselor, what would you suggest? The Kethvar have made it clear that they don't respect basic principles of informed consent. They've essentially declared that they consider sapient beings to be research materials. How do you negotiate with that position? Through established council procedures, Velith replied, though her bioluminescent patterns suggested she wasn't entirely convinced by her own words. Formal complaints, investigative committees, sanctions if necessary. Morrison let out a sound that might have been laughter if it weren't so cold. Counselor, with respect, how long do those procedures take? Months? Years? And what happens to humans during that time? Do we just accept being research subjects while the bureaucracy slowly grinds through the proper forms? The question hung in the air unanswered. Around the reception hall, the other species were beginning to understand the fundamental problem. Their civilization's elaborate systems for resolving disputes were designed for conflicts between species that shared basic assumptions about the rights of sapient beings. When one species viewed others as experimental subjects, those systems broke down completely. Zakhan was struggling to speak through the pain Sarah was inflicting, his words coming out in desperate gasps. Please, we can modify our research parameters, find acceptable methodologies. Sarah's grip tightened fractionally, and his words cut off entirely. First researcher, here's the problem with your offer. You're still thinking like a predator who's been caught. You're offering to modify your hunting techniques, not to stop hunting altogether. She looked around the reception hall, addressing the assembled alien observers. This is a teachable moment for everyone here. You're witnessing what happens when a species assumes that humans will continue to follow your social protocols even after you've violated the most basic principles of civilized behavior. The Kethvar operative who had spoken earlier was becoming increasingly agitated, their neural tendrils moving in frantic patterns. Honored Ambassador, surely you understand that scientific advancement requires some degree of direct observation. Our methods may seem extreme, but the potential benefits to galactic knowledge are immense. Sarah turned her full attention to the operative, and the alien actually staggered backward under the weight of her gaze. You know what's fascinating about that statement? You're still trying to justify torture by claiming it's for the greater good. That's exactly the kind of thinking that led to some of the darkest chapters in human history. Morrison nodded grimly. We have extensive historical records of what happens when beings start treating others as experimental subjects for the advancement of knowledge. The results are never as beneficial as the researchers claim they'll be. The operative's tendrils were now moving in patterns that suggested genuine panic. But, surely the advancement of scientific knowledge justifies some degree of discomfort to research subjects? The question revealed so much about the Kethvar mindset that Sarah actually felt a moment of genuine pity for the alien. They genuinely couldn't understand why torture for scientific purposes wasn't acceptable, which suggested that their own civilization had never developed the ethical frameworks that most species considered fundamental to civilized behavior. No, Sarah said simply, her voice carrying absolute finality. It doesn't. Ever. Under any circumstances. The moment you start treating sapient beings as objects for experimentation without their informed consent, you stop being researchers and become something else entirely. Zakhan was making increasingly desperate sounds as the pain continued, his neural tendrils beginning to show signs of stress-induced damage. His pale blue skin was now almost entirely gray, and his breathing had become so shallow that Sarah was beginning to worry about permanent physiological damage. But she also knew that releasing him too early would send the wrong message to both the Kethvar and the other alien observers. This confrontation wasn't just about stopping one research project. It was about establishing fundamental boundaries that would govern how humanity was treated by the galactic community. Here's what's going to happen, Sarah said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from representing not just herself, but her entire species. First, researcher Zakhan is going to formally apologize for his planned research program. The Kethvar Collective is going to submit to a full council investigation of their research methods. And every being in this room is going to understand that humans are not experimental subjects. She looked around the reception hall, making eye contact with representatives from dozens of species. We're willing to be partners, allies, friends. We're happy to share our knowledge, our perspectives, our capabilities for the benefit of galactic civilization. But we are not research animals, and any species that treats us as such will discover exactly why Earth earned its classification as a Class 12 death world. The silence that followed her words was profound and complete. In that moment, Every alien in the reception hall understood that they were witnessing the emergence of a new factor in galactic politics, a species that combined the intellectual sophistication necessary for interstellar civilization with the survival instincts of apex predators. Counselor Velith was the first to break the silence, her voice carrying a weight of understanding that hadn't been there before. Ambassador Chun, I believe I speak for the entire council when I say that we fully support your position. The principles you've outlined regarding informed consent and the treatment of sapient beings are fundamental to civilized society. Sarah nodded acknowledgement, but didn't release her grip on Zakon. Thank you, Counselor. But I think it's important that this lesson be delivered by the beings who were intended to be the experimental subjects. The Kethvar need to understand that humans don't just file formal complaints when threatened. We solve problems. Around the room, the alien observers were beginning to understand that they weren't just witnessing a diplomatic incident. They were watching the birth of a new paradigm in galactic relations, one where the threat of becoming someone's research project would be met with immediate and overwhelming response from a species that had evolved to be very, very good at neutralizing threats. The resolution, when it came, was swift and decisive. Sarah finally released her grip on Zakon, and the Kethvar researcher collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath while his neural tendrils hung limply around his head like defeated banners. The marks where Sarah's fingers had pressed into his skin were clearly visible, and would remain so for days as a reminder of what happened when someone mistook human diplomatic restraint for weakness. Commander Morrison maintained his defensive position for several more seconds, ensuring that the other Kethvar operatives understood that any aggressive movement would be met with immediate response. Only when it became clear that they were more interested in helping their leader than continuing their research program did he relax slightly, though his military bearing remained evident. Counselor Velith stepped forward, her bioluminescent patterns now displaying the complex colors that indicated formal council authority. By the powers vested in me as a senior council representative, I hereby place the Kethvar delegation under protective custody, pending a full investigation into their research methods and objectives. The euphemistic language didn't fool anyone in the room. Protective custody was simply a diplomatic way of saying that the Kethvar would be confined until the council could determine the full extent of their violations and decide on appropriate consequences. Sarah straightened her diplomatic attire and smoothed down her hair, the same hair that had started this entire confrontation when Zakon had grabbed it without permission. The gesture was symbolic, a return to civilized behavior now that the immediate threat had been neutralized. Thank you, Counselor, she said formally. Humanity appreciates the Council's swift response to this situation. Around the reception hall, the other alien species were beginning to process what they had witnessed. The conversations that resumed were subdued and careful, with many representatives casting frequent glances toward the two humans who had just demonstrated that Earth's classification as a death world wasn't merely academic. The crystalline Zolonians were chiming in frequencies that suggested they were updating their entire cultural understanding of human capabilities. The Thalassans had emerged fully from their environmental suits for the first time in the evening, apparently deciding that the humans represented less of a threat than they had initially assumed. But it was the Corvalians who surprised everyone by approaching Sarah and Morrison directly. The towering tree-like beings swayed in patterns that their species used to indicate deep respect, and their leader spoke through a translation device with words that carried the weight of formal recognition. Ambassador Chun, Commander Morrison, the Corvalians said, their bark-like skin rustling with emotion, we wish to formally acknowledge that we may have underestimated humanity's potential contributions to galactic civilization. Sarah inclined her head respectfully. Thank you, honored Corvalian. We hope that tonight's events won't overshadow the genuine desire for peaceful cooperation that brought us here. The Corvalian's branches swayed in what Sarah had learned indicated thoughtful consideration. On the contrary, Ambassador, tonight has demonstrated that humans possess exactly the kind of principled strength that the galaxy needs. Too many species have grown complacent in their safety, assuming that civilized behavior is universal. It is refreshing to encounter beings who can defend civilization when it is threatened. Commander Morrison stepped forward, his diplomatic facade now fully restored. The Corvallian speaks wisdom. But I hope it's also clear that humans prefer negotiation to confrontation. What happened here tonight was a response to a specific threat, not our default approach to diplomacy. Indeed, the Corvallian replied, and that restraint makes your response all the more meaningful. A species that possesses such capabilities but chooses to use them judiciously is exactly the kind of ally the galaxy needs. Across the reception hall, other conversations were beginning to reflect similar themes. Sarah could hear representatives from various species discussing humanity in terms that were fundamentally different from the cautious curiosity that had characterized earlier interactions. There was a new respect in their voices, but also a new understanding of what humanity represented. The Zolonians had begun chiming in harmonies that their translators rendered as philosophical discussions about the relationship between evolution and ethics. The Thalassans were engaging in rapid conversations about updating their threat assessment protocols, not because they viewed humans as dangerous, but because they recognized the need to understand species that approached problem-solving from fundamentally different perspectives. Counselor Velith returned from coordinating the removal of the Kethvar delegation, her bioluminescent patterns now displaying the complex colors that indicated she was processing significant new information. "Ambassador Chan," she said, "I believe we need to have a more comprehensive discussion about humanity's integration into galactic society." Sarah felt a familiar diplomatic tension at those words. "Is there a problem with our membership status, Counselor?" "Quite the opposite," Velith replied, her patterns shifting to colors that suggested genuine admiration. "Tonight has demonstrated that humanity possesses capabilities that the Council didn't fully understand when we approved your membership. We need to discuss how those capabilities might be utilized for the benefit of galactic civilization." Morrison's expression took on the carefully neutral look that experienced diplomats wore when they sensed an incoming request that might be more complicated than it initially appeared. "What kind of utilization are we discussing, Counselor?" Velith's patterns shifted through several color combinations before settling on hues that indicated she was choosing her words carefully. "There are situations that arise in galactic politics where traditional diplomatic solutions prove insufficient. Species that don't respond to economic sanctions, negotiations, or even council censure. Until now, our only options have been either ineffective symbolic responses or actions that would violate our own ethical principles." Sarah began to understand where the conversation was heading. "And you believe that humans might offer additional options?" "I believe," Velith said slowly, "that humans might offer the galaxy something it has never had before, the ability to enforce civilized behavior without compromising civilized principles. The way you handled the Kethvar situation demonstrates a capability for measured, proportional response to threats that most species simply don't possess." The implications were staggering. The Galactic Council was essentially asking humanity to serve as the galaxy's police force, using their Deathworld evolved capabilities to deal with species and situations that couldn't be handled through normal diplomatic channels. Commander Morrison was the first to speak. "Counselor, that's a significant responsibility, and it could fundamentally change how other species view humanity." "It could," Velith agreed, "but consider the alternative. Without some mechanism for enforcing basic standards of civilized behavior, species like the Kethvar will continue to exploit the galaxy's commitment to peaceful resolution. They'll treat other beings as experimental subjects because they know there are no real consequences for such behavior." Sarah found herself thinking about the broader implications of what Velith was suggesting. Humanity had entered galactic society hoping to be accepted as equals, to contribute their knowledge and perspectives to a peaceful community of species. But their unique evolutionary background meant that they possessed capabilities that other species either lacked entirely or had evolved away from over millennia of civilized development. "This would need to be discussed extensively with our government," Sarah said carefully. "And any such arrangement would require strict oversight and clearly defined limitations." "Of course," Velith replied, "and those discussions would involve the full council. But I wanted you to understand that tonight's events haven't damaged humanity's standing in galactic society. If anything, they've demonstrated why your species might be exactly what the galaxy needs." Around the reception hall, The evening was beginning to wind down. The Kethvar delegation had been removed, the immediate threat neutralized, and the other species were processing the implications of what they had witnessed. But Sarah could sense that the real consequences of tonight's events were only beginning to unfold. The reception had been intended as a celebration of humanity's integration into galactic society. Instead, it had become a demonstration of why that integration might be more significant than anyone had initially understood. Humans weren't just another species joining the galactic community. They were a species that could fill a role that the community had never had before, the protectors of civilized behavior in a galaxy that had grown perhaps too comfortable with its own civility. As the evening concluded and the various delegations began to depart, Sarah reflected on the strange path that had led from a simple act of grabbing someone's hair to a fundamental shift in galactic politics. The Kethvar researcher had intended to study human stress responses under controlled conditions. Instead, he had triggered exactly the kind of response that would reshape how the galaxy understood the relationship between civilization and strength. Commander Morrison joined her as they prepared to leave the reception hall. "Well, Ambassador," he said with the dry humor that had carried him through years of military service, "I think we can safely say that tonight's diplomatic mission was a success." Sarah smiled, genuine amusement cutting through the exhaustion of the evening's events. "I'm not sure our diplomatic training covered this particular scenario, Commander." "No," Morrison agreed, "but our human training did. And, in the end, that's what mattered." As they walked toward the exit, Sarah caught sight of her reflection in one of the polished metal panels that lined the corridor. Her hair was still slightly disheveled from the evening's confrontation, and she could see the steel in her own eyes that had emerged when civilized behavior proved insufficient to protect her species' dignity and autonomy. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the galactic community processed the implications of tonight's events. There would be discussions, negotiations, and careful diplomatic maneuvering as humanity's role in galactic society evolved in ways no one had anticipated. But, tonight, the message had been delivered with crystal clarity. Humans were partners in galactic civilization, not subjects for experimentation. And any being who forgot that distinction would discover exactly why evolution had made humanity very, very good at reminding others to respect basic principles of civilized behavior. The hair incident, as it would come to be known in galactic diplomatic circles, had ended with the Kethvar researcher learning a fundamental truth about human nature. Grab a human's hair without permission, and you'll quickly discover that Deathworld evolution produces beings who are perfectly capable of teaching lessons that no one involved will ever forget.